Welcome, welcome, lunchtime learners. Always so good to see everybody. So, as usual, we'll start with just a few announcements in case you haven't heard. Something's happening next week, Expedition Days. So, you've all been wonderful and signed up for lots of shifts, but there's still some openings. And so, if you could help out, I know that Jen and Claire would really appreciate it, and the children of Phoenix will really benefit from your presence. So if you have any time available, go on Better Impact and see what's open. In the meantime, come join the party. In case you haven't heard, the Conservancy is hosting a tent at Canal Convergence. And if you haven't been, it is a ton of fun. It's a 10-day festival, arts and light show, all kinds of fancy lit sculptures along the canal. We're hosting a tent. The 2 weekends that frame the event, there's still openings, and we could use some help to man our tent the weekend of November 11th through the 13th. So I think you really have a good time. There's tons and tons of people that come, and it's such a wonderful opportunity for us to be able to tell everyone about our beautiful preserve, our wonderful conservancy, and the need to be sure that we save natural open spaces. Our next Lunch and Learn is on November 10th, and it's going to be done by the organization called Leave No Trace. And they're going to help us to effectively communicate to our visitors how we can all work together to protect our beautiful environment. That's all the announcements I have, and I will introduce our old friend who does not need introduction to many of you, but Jacques is a retired master steward. He joined the Conservancy in 2009 and was an active hike leader, as well as instructor for all new stewards. I think it was called New Steward Orientation then. That's now called S101. He's a retired professor of industrial design from ASU. He's originally from Montreal, and as you heard by our conversation, he's now moved back to his beloved Canada, and we miss him. He's a passionate photographer, and if you are his Facebook friend, you have the privilege of seeing his breathtaking photos, especially now around the autumn. He's here with us today to share how creatures create shelter in the desert and for us to see what we can learn from them. So welcome, Jacques, and I'll let you take it away.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here and to be among people that I got to know extremely well, to be a part of their world and their community as a member of the McDowell-Sonora Conservancy. And then for those of you who I never got to know well because I left, thank you so much for being members of the Conservancy and doing what you're doing to preserve what is a jewel of Scottsdale. I'm going to be talking to you today about what we can learn from how animals, whether we're talking about insects or mammals, birds, reptiles, how they survive, how they shelter in the desert. Now, some of you may know another talk that I give on biomimicry, and I'm a big believer that if we are humble enough as human beings, we can learn a great deal from looking at how nature deals with similar problems to what we have, whether it's food, shelter, any of these issues that are rather common. Now, as you learned from Max, I'm a retired professor. We tend to be very wordy, we talk, we digress, and I fit that mold extremely well. So bear with me as I meander through this talk. I'm going to load the presentation because you're not going to be watching a talking head, but we're going to have a slideshow of sorts, one of these dreaded PowerPoints. And I'm hoping that I'll be able to, and please tell me if you can or cannot see it. There it is. Is it visible to everybody?
Perfect. Absolutely perfect.
It is. Okay. Now it seems to have cut off the bottom a little bit because I think my name should have appeared there and it doesn't. That's rather strange, but we will move on. The fact that my name does not appear is not such a big thing. Now I'm going to try to move forward with this, and it's not working. Let me try one other button here, return. Maybe I can do it this way. All right, so I'm going to have to scroll through. I thought I could solve that problem, and I tried it earlier and it seemed to work, but it's not working now. Anyways, I'm going to get a little bit academic at this moment. And some of you may remember in Psych 101 what was called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And it's not a theory as such, it is a proposition in a way by Maslow. And basically, what it proposes is that we tend to follow this kind of pyramid of needs by beginning to deal with things that are physiologically needed. For example, we need to drink, we need to eat, we need to breathe, we need sleep and that. And anything else is almost secondary. In fact, it is secondary, because without that, we just don't exist. Then we get into the areas of safety needs, and I won't belabor the point: love and belonging, esteem, self-actualization. A little bit of academia. But what I want to deal with is that bottom part, but especially as you see there, that fourth word, shelter. And I want to deal with shelter because that is a fundamental need. We have it as human beings, but of course, animals, insects, reptiles have it as well. And how do they go about dealing with that? And let me scroll to the next one, that being the case. How do animals deal with it? Because they do have to a shelter. We have seasons, we have weather events. Last night, for example, here, to our surprise, near the end of October, we had thunder and lightning, which usually does not happen. So I'm sure that the animals out here were trying to shelter. We have a dog that jumped onto our bed because that thunder did not make it a very happy animal. And so all we have to do as we walk around the desert is we can begin to see, if you begin to observe and look more closely, that animals, birds, reptiles and that find ways to have shelter. That's shelter from the weather, but also for protection, for the rearing of young and all of that. And you may have seen, for example, as we see here, this gilded flicker going into the hollow of a saguaro. And that's its form of shelter. So what we're going to do is we're going to start from the ground up, because shelters tend to exist for them below ground, on the ground, and above ground. At this point, I'm going to digress. Anybody who thought that this talk was going to be how to build a shelter in the desert, in case you were lost, sorry, that's not what this talk is going to be about. Or if anybody thought it was going to be about how to design a home for the desert, because you have just bought a property and you want to put up a house, and you've decided that you're going to design your own house, and this is not going to be about it, except that you could learn a few things about some of the principles you could follow. What we're going to look at really is how animals create shelter for themselves, and where there are lessons for us to go forward if we do want to build, if we do want to buy a house, what we should be looking for perhaps. But I'm not a realtor. I'm not going to be talking about real estate and houses as such. So we're going to start from below ground. And if you've walked around the desert at all, you probably have noticed at some point there are at times holes, small holes, medium-sized holes, larger holes, and these are, in most cases, shelters. We know, for example, that the small holes are shelters for small insects. There are ants, of course, but there are also bees that live there. Tarantulas live there. As the holes get bigger, usually a good rule of thumb is that the animal that is in there is a larger animal. So it could be a desert mouse, it could be a ground squirrel. And then as the holes get even larger, and there are some large ones, you can see this usually in the banks of arroyos. Those could be anything from tortoises to even larger holes that I've seen, for example, up in the Tom Thumb area, of badgers. Never seen a badger in all the times I've hiked in there, but I certainly know that those are most likely badger holes. Then, there's a little ground squirrel. So ground squirrels are known to live in burrows underground. Then we go to those animals that live above ground. Again, you could walk by one of these sort of dumping grounds. You see it there with some prickly pear cactus, there's some cholla balls, there's some twigs. But ask yourself, why do these cholla balls, when there isn't usually, sometimes there isn't a cholla within several yards of this area, why have they all gathered in this one place? Why have all those sticks gathered there? And that's because there is a pack rat. And if you've been on a hike with Marcia or others, they'd love to talk to you about pack rats and the life of pack rats and what goes on in a pack rat's nest. What the pack rat does is it builds a nest, and it builds a nest with material that it finds. And it builds it in a very particular way. And there are reasons for that, and we will go into that a little bit later. Also, on the ground or slightly above the ground, especially in the rocky areas, you've probably noticed that there are all kinds of crevices. There are areas that you could certainly, well, you don't want to put your hand down there because you know that is an area that could not only have, as we see here, a chuckwalla, but it could have rattlesnakes or other critters that you don't want to disturb. But those are areas above the ground that, or on the ground or slightly above the ground, where shelter is found. So these are found places. They're not actually built like the pack rat will actually build something. They actually construct it. Think of a beaver that builds a lodge or a beaver dam. Chuckwallas will use what is found as far as a cavity and use it as a shelter area. You even find on the ground, it's not a shelter as such, but it's certainly a place of rest. You can be walking and there are tall grasses in this field. And all of a sudden there's an area where all the tall grasses are down. Well, if you get there a little bit closer, you'll probably find, for example, the hair of either javelinas or deer. It would not be unusual that a small herd of deer, like these mule deer, would have spent time in that area overnight. So that became a temporary shelter for them. Let me just turn off my other computer here. And then you go above ground. Those animals, especially birds, that go above ground. Anybody know what this is besides being a cholla plant? Asking for class participation here.
Is it a nest of a cactus wren?
It is. Thank you very much. Who is it who spoke up?
Of course, the smartest person in class.
Oh, well, you get extra points. You get extra points for this. Yeah, this is a football-sized bird nest, and you will find them. Again, you have to look for them because they're well camouflaged. But it's a cactus wren, and it builds this magnificent nest. And it does it above ground because it makes sense. It wants to protect its eggs, and also being in a cholla tree, it sort of creates, what I call a gated community, because those little spikes will keep a lot of the critters that may want to have access to those eggs. It'll keep them away because it's a natural barrier. And then, of course, as you saw from one of the first slides, you have the gilded flicker. And if you look at saguaros and you see the holes in them, you know that those are shelters, and various birds will live there, from the Gila woodpecker to the gilded flicker, and then small owls and other birds afterwards. It is the woodpecker and the flicker that actually create the hole and create the nest, and then the saguaro boot that follows. But that is a shelter well above ground, and again, for reasons not only of protection from the elements, but also protection from anything that would want to invade that nest. So what are some of the lessons that we can learn by looking, by observing, by studying what our animal friends do in the desert? Well, first, the reason that animals will go underground is, besides protection, because it is covered, is temperature. The desert, and those of you, all of you who live there know, plays a big role in how you survive. And it gets hot like it can get cold. And the ground can create an excellent thermal barrier. And so we know that animals that live underground with the thermal barrier of the earth will be at a much better temperature, as far as a temperature that will support life, than the blazing heat of the desert sun or the cold nights when it gets to or even slightly below freezing. And so temperature plays a big role in why animals would want to go underground. It's one of those, and we do it in our homes by the thickness of walls. So temperature is one factor. How do they protect themselves from the extremes of temperature? Then location, as far as protection from hostile forces, whatever those are. We tend to put fences around our houses. They're symbolic now, but at one time, those fences were actual walls, and they would protect us from anybody who was trying to invade. The saguaro serves that kind of protection. You've got the barbs all the way around. You've got the height of that shelter above the ground. It makes it very difficult for other animals to get there. And much like the underground structure, that is the thermal barrier created by land, you've got the thermal barrier created by the wall of saguaros. There can be, as I remember, there can be up to a 20 degrees difference between the outside temperature in an environment and the inside temperature in the saguaro. So if it's 100 outside, it could be 80 degrees inside the saguaro, which makes it a reasonable temperature. So location is important. Creating a shelter for unexpected events that can occur. Again, I mentioned, and maybe I did it too quickly, but this is a kind of gated community. Not only is the hole to get into this nest the only entry, and therefore it can be blocked, is the only way that something can get in. You've got all the prickly aspects of the cholla that will prevent and help protect whatever is in there, the cactus wren and the young cactus wren. So these are some of the conditions that instinctively animals do. They're not doing this because they have an actual plan. It's the instinct that allows them to survive and go on and create families and move on to generation after generation. Now, humans were not that different. And now I'm going to be talking about early human settlement in the desert. If you go to the desert botanical garden, you will find in one area of it, they've created a kind of full-size display of how they think early natives who lived in the Sonoran Desert, how they created shelter. Of course, they had to create shelter with what was found material. And in this case, it's simple brush, mud, bits of trees. We know there are not many sort of materials. That's not as plenty as the Northwest forest, for example. If you think of the Haida people using redwood and other large trees like cedar. In the Sonoran Desert, you don't have that. You certainly up further north, when you get into the Flagstaff area, you've got the ponderosa pine, but in this area you don't. And so you have to make do with whatever you have. So on this very simple shelter, round was usually the way it was done because it just tended to make sense to make it round. And that's not an unusual shape. We find that in other native cultures. The igloo is round. A lot of the native huts that I've seen in parts of Africa are round. There is mud up on top that helps to seal against the occasional rain. Otherwise, you are sheltered there from especially the sun. This is a very basic thing. It can be built most anywhere, and you can fix it quite easily because the material you need doesn't have to be imported from somewhere. It's whatever you end up finding close to where you live. So the idea of using found material and designing based on conditions that existed there were really on top of the list of how you designed a shelter. It wasn't borrowing from some culture elsewhere because there was very little contact with other cultures. It was simply doing best with what you had in that place. Moving on, the construction and the permanency of homes begins to be more regimented. And then if you go to, what is that wonderful museum just in close to the airport?
Pueblo Grande.
There it is. I've got it marked, the Pueblo Grande Museum. And you can see that they've replicated what would have been typical shelters of the people who lived there. These were the early natives in the Rio Salado area. And this is using mud, again, a found material, and a very simple structure using usually things like saguaro ribs and whatever bits of trees that they could find, whether it was palo verde or ironwood, as you can see with this little ramada shelter here. And you can go visit the Pueblo Grande and find out a lot about how people did use what was available to them and use it in conditions that were local, because that is what made sense. Go a little bit further north and get into the more mountainous areas where there's more rocks and less as far as trees or woods and that. And it begins to make more sense to use the found stone. So these are the cliff dwellings at the Tonto National Monument. I'm sure that some of you have gone there, but that's not the only place you can find that. In Colorado at Mesa Verde, and even the wonderful structures that exist in Canyon de Chelly. You can see again, found material used in the most logical way. And I'll deal with a bit more because this also touches on things like location and orientation. Those are also important factors. And then more recently, so we're talking about the 19th century now and the early 20th century, what you see more, let's say, in the New Mexico area, even though you can find some in Arizona, is the adobe construction. And again, it's mud, and this time though, with the use of straw. And it creates that very thick visual architectural language with no sharp edges. It's very difficult to make sharp edges out of mud. And why should you? There's no reason to make sharp edges. So all of a sudden, you go away from a typical wood construction, let's say, which would have sharp edges, which gives a building a very distinctive style, to these sort of soft, rounded qualities. And that is really a form follows function aspect, because the form of the building ends up looking the way it looks because the function of adobe is such that it's best done when it's rounded as you see it here. So what are some of the lessons that we can learn, therefore, from these early human settlers? Because they didn't have access to technologies that we have today. They didn't have access to Home Depot. They didn't have the web. They couldn't order things in. They couldn't borrow from a kind of historical style from some other culture and bring it here. They had to use whatever they had, and yet they created structures that made a great deal of sense. So, for example, material tended to be local. This is the inside of one of those shelters at Pueblo Grande. And what you're able to see there are the saguaro ribs. And then whatever minimal timber that you can find, and straight timber in the Sonoran Desert is not easy to find. I know that when I visited Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, we were told that they brought ponderosa pine hundreds of miles at times because they did not have large straight timber. And so again, a piece of timber, as you can see, this beam going across the roof would have been a valuable piece of material, but basically found somewhere not that far that they were able to bring it. But certainly we're not talking about great distances. So local material makes sense. In this day and age, it's beginning to make more and more sense because of global warming, having to bring in wood from Brazil because we think that the grain of that wood is especially nice, begins to be a disputable proposition, given the cost to bring it, the energy to bring it here. Why not start looking at what we have locally and use that instead? The insulation that comes from using thick walls. We may think that thick walls are a nice architectural feature, but they're really there both because the stone they were using was thick, but the thick walls also added to the insulation property that we saw, for example, with the insects or the small animals that live underground. Julie was mentioning that she had been to, they've just returned from Italy and went in and visited a lot of places. I heard the word cathedral. It's amazing that you can go into these older churches in small villages and in towns and large cities in Europe. The walls are very thick because they are made of stone. And yet, even though it's warm outside, sometimes even hot outside, you can walk inside and it's nice and cool. Native people knew that. This is not rocket science. And so the idea of using thick walls to insulate made sense. Also, to have fewer windows and smaller doors. In other words, to not allow the heat from intense light to get in. Because once the inside is heated, it's very difficult to cool it. You don't have air conditioning. So the thickness of the wall begins to play a role. And Native people knew that. Orientation. If you visit a lot of these cliff dwellings, so this is in Canyon de Chelly, you'll find that most of them are oriented towards the south. And they did that on purpose. That is, in the winter, the sun is lower on the horizon and therefore would shine onto the buildings and help to warm them up. In the summer, the sun is higher in the horizon and the overhanging cliff would allow it to create a kind of umbrella or parasol and prevent the sun from shining down. And so orientation was important, something that we don't consider as much as we should, because when a developer puts up a housing development, the houses are positioned on each one of the lots and what makes more sense to use that lot, where the windows point. And the large windows pointed towards the west will just create a heat sink and will just heat up the house. And of course, that the immediate solution is simply to get a second air conditioning unit. But if we had choices, we would not want to put too many windows towards the west, more windows towards the north, for example. Now, have there been contemporary attempts at designing homes, keeping in mind some of these concepts? And there have been. And probably the one person that led the way in the 1930s was Frank Lloyd Wright. Now, I'm sure that most of you have been, and if you haven't, you should go and visit Taliesin West. And when you visit Taliesin West, you may just see some rather unusual buildings. You may even say things like, it's nice, but I wouldn't want to live there. And what was Frank Lloyd Wright thinking when he did this? And why did he pick this or that? Frank Lloyd Wright was a very thoughtful person. Certainly, he was very mindful of context. That is, he was very mindful of place. Some of his buildings, for example, almost seem, and certainly Taliesin is one of these, to be growing out of the desert. Now, he does that, and that's just a visual architectural aspect of the building by using the local stone. He's not bringing stone from some quarry in some third world country. He's using the granite and other stone that he found at the base of the mountains in the Sonoran Desert. But more than that, the actual building itself really pays respect to the demands that the Sonoran Desert places on a building. For example, the heat. We know we can't avoid that. It would be like designing a building in Wisconsin and thinking that winter doesn't happen. It happens. Get over it. Being cognizant of the light. The light is both good and bad. The light in Arizona is absolutely beautiful. But it also, in the summer, comes with intense heat. How do you use that? So, for example, in the main sort of drawing room, what Frank Lloyd Wright wanted was to make sure that the light was there to light a place and not to heat the place. And so he made sure that things were well ventilated. He used a lot of natural air currents by way of the Venturi effect. And he certainly made clear that you don't start putting large windows, open windows, towards the west, where the most intense light is, especially afternoon. And so he looked at that. He had thick walls using stone. I'm not saying that he borrowed from the native culture, but he certainly would have understood that it insulates better than thin walls as such. And what he was doing was, and he called it organic architecture. He was trying to look at nature as a source of organic ideas and then replicate those ideas into an actual building. And by the way, he was very much, when I say that he respected the context, you turn around and he goes to New York and he does the Guggenheim Museum in New York City. And New York City is a totally different context, a totally different environment to the Sonoran Desert. And of course, designs a totally different building. He wasn't one of these architects who develops a style and then replicates that style, whether he's in Chicago or San Diego or Santa Fe. Frank Lloyd Wright was very good at understanding where the building is, and the building should be of the place, not of some style that belongs elsewhere. And when he taught his students, one of the things that he did, which a lot of schools of architecture do not do, unfortunately, is that his students would actually, on the property at Taliesin West, and the public generally doesn't have access to this area, the students would have to create a shelter for themselves and live in it, in this desert environment. This is one of these student-built houses or shelters that was done there. And so here, in this case, the student would learn to live in a place or design by living in a place, not design theoretically through some kind of textbook experience. A few schools of architecture put students through that pace, and it's unfortunate that, as far as I know now, that school has since closed down. There is one other person, and I find it quite amazing that two of the most phenomenal architects of the last century in the United States both lived in Arizona for an extended period of time. The other person is Paolo Soleri, who was a student of Frank Lloyd Wright, but went in a very different direction compared to Frank Lloyd Wright. This is Paulo Solari's first experimentation of desert living and desert homes. You can visit it. You can't visit the home itself, but you can certainly visit the grounds where they cast the Solari bells. And what Solari did was design homes out of found material, that is the dirt that was there, into concrete kind of dwellings, as you can see here, which is not dissimilar to, again, going underground, as we saw some of the animals do, or slightly above ground, like the chuckwalla does. And so you've got these thick walled buildings using what is local, and therefore the buildings seem to be part of the place and not a kind of violation in visual terms of what the Sonoran Desert is. Because the Sonoran Desert, as we know, as stewards who go out there most every day, is a beautiful place. He then went on to develop what was his tour de force, which is Arcosanti, about an hour north of Phoenix. And I don't know how many of you have been there, but it's worth a visit. It is one of those dreams that he had, and he never got to see it completed. And it's going to take a long time before it's completed, because only a small fraction of it is done. But what was important about what he did in Arcosanti is the philosophy that he developed there. And that philosophy, and I'll just skip right through it right here because I want to make this point here, is arcology. Unlike Frank Lloyd Wright, who talked about organic architecture, and really what he was trying to do was simply create a building that seemed to be in its right place. It didn't violate any kind of visual code of the place. Paulo Solari went one step further. He talked about the ecology of the place and architecture. And the symbiosis of the two, the combination or the fusion of the two, becomes what he called arcology. And his belief was that you cannot separate the ecology of a place from the architecture of that place. So in this case, up in Arcosanti, he has got, I think, about 640 acres of land, and yet the building's footprint is very small. The building's footprint must be, I'm going to take a guess here, 20, 30 acres or so. And basically he would have been against, he's since passed, unfortunately, he would have been against the typical kind of development where you would take 100 acres of land, you would create 1 acre plots, you put a house on every acre, you have some common ground, and that's it. He felt that would not allow the ecology to exist as an ecological environment, and that the architecture would then impose itself and it would throw it out of balance. He was certainly an early advocate, even though he may not have called himself that, of sustainability as we are seeing it now. And so if you haven't gone to Arcosanti, I would suggest that you go just to see another way of doing it. And even more recently, APS. This goes back to the 1990s now. APS asked Jones Studio to design what this firm of architects would think would be an environmental home for the desert. Not the kind of homes that are being built, and I'm not going to get into any kind of criticism or judgmental point of view as far as the kind of architecture that is being done in Scottsdale or elsewhere in the Phoenix area. But could we design homes that seem to be more of the place, much like Frank Lloyd Wright was saying, or more aware of the ecology like Paulo Solari did? And they did the environmental showcase home, which they used to bring developers and potential homeowners to see what a home could look like. I'm afraid to say that after about 10 years, and the house was given to ASU as a place to continue experiments in desert living, it did not meet a great favor from the average homeowner. I don't think that people were yet aware of things, and I don't think in the 1990s we were talking about climate change. We were talking about these extreme changes in weather, the fires in California and the flooding that is occurring in the Southeast. So maybe it was a little bit too early, and we're going to have to revisit some of this. But even, here's something from their website talking about an immensely satisfying palette of natural and reusable materials, as well as state-of-the-art passive and active solar design. And all of you are probably aware, because you are stewards, that the buildings on the McDowell Sonoran Preserve have all been designed with this kind of contemporary attempt to really integrate an artificial structure, the building, the trailhead, into a natural environment. And how little can we do to violate the kind of beauty that exists in a natural place like the Sonoran Desert. So this was one of the first trailhead buildings, which is the one at Lost Dog Wash by Weddell Gilmore. And here what we have is a building that attempts to, and using their words from their website, an example of commitment to the environment through its preservation of native habitat, materials that blend with the natural desert environment. The rammed earth walls of the structure utilize earth material that was excavated during foundation construction. So we go back to what animals do, using of found materials, using what is local so that it blends in, doing what Frank Lloyd Wright is talking about, that is creating a building that is of the place. It's not, a borrowed style a la Las Vegas, but Las Vegas has its place. I have nothing against Las Vegas. But the Eiffel Tower does not belong in Las Vegas. It belongs in Paris, but it's nice to have it there. And we see that with some of the other buildings now that have been put up, and they've all followed that same kind of respect for the place. So the architects that have been involved have really been considerate as far as the materials used, the design of the building, orientation of the building, so that it makes sense. So for example, as I found out, some of you may know this, but some of you may not, the trailhead at the Browns Ranch, it was purposely built where it is so that neighbors could not see it. The people who are in the development, as you enter Browns Ranch, as you go in, you can't see that trailhead building. It is below that ridge. And that was done on purpose so that the people who live there could still see the desert without having all of a sudden a building there. And then the trailhead itself is secluded from the rest of it, so it's in its own world. That takes some thoughtful thinking on the part of architects and respect for people who are there. So it all begins by understanding the challenge of the context. The Sonoran Desert is a very special place. It imposes certain conditions. It's dry, doesn't get much rain. It has a lot of light. It gets a lot of heat. And yet, I learned myself living there, I gave up on trying to grow certain trees and certain plants in my home because it didn't make sense. And once I started planting things like, I'm trying to think of some of the plants that I had now, but agaves, for example, you don't have to take care of them. They just take care of themselves. And that's because they come of that place. So the 5 factors I have found to be rather important when we're talking about shelter in the desert, and animals have done really well in looking at these, are temperature, light, location, orientation, and it all comes down to sustainability. Temperature, we know the temperatures can be extreme. Native people knew that, they built accordingly, and we can certainly build accordingly. In the case of the trailhead at Lost Aguash, the rammed earth. We're starting to use, for example, solid styrofoam buildings now. And then you put a cladding on the outside. Hay bale construction. There are ways we can build things without having simply to make an acceptable wall thickness, but then putting in a lot of air conditioning units. That may not be in the future the best way to go. Light is there, but let's use it in the appropriate way. I've mentioned already that putting large windows facing west may not be the wisest choice. And so, yes, that there is light. Light comes with heat, but let's be smart about how we use it. Where we locate a building, how we use the location of that area, where the building is in respect to what we find naturally in that site is rather important. Admittedly, in a development where we are Chichajal, it doesn't make sense. But those of you who have the luxury of maybe going up north, as Steve was mentioning earlier about buying a property up in Payson, before you actually put a house on there, start looking where you locate that house and where it will sit as far as respecting some of the natural features and what it does, where it fits and be part of the ecology, not simply an imposition to the ecology. How you orient the building. You know, we know that the sun rises in the east, sets in the west. It's going to continue doing that for some time. And so where you locate a building, where you locate your shelter, where your windows are, where your doors are, that is rather important. I'm going to toot my own horn here. We built a house on a small lot where we worked with a net zero builder. So we use very little energy. We've got passive solar, so we oriented the large windows that overlook the property. It basically faces south, but the angle of the roof is such that in the summer, we don't get too much sun coming in. In the winter, the sun is lower down, and it basically helps heat the house. Our neighbors, most of them haven't done this at all. They've got, typical, nothing wrong here, not being critical, typical Cape Cod type of houses with little sort of windows here and there everywhere. And they think our house is a little bit weird, but our house works really well for us. And so if you have that luxury, please think about that. And what it ends up in the end is all about sustainability. Sustainability is not, as somebody told me once, somebody in Paradise Valley who put up a house and 5,000 square feet. They are one couple, retired couple, and they thought they were sustainable because they got floors made out of bamboo. That's not sustainable. Sustainable, it goes much broader than just using bamboo on your floors. And so the idea of what are we doing that will make it possible for others after us to be able to enjoy this wonderful, wonderful planet. And in the case of where you are, the wonderful Sonoran Desert. Already by having the preserve and what the first stewards did to create the McDowell Sonoran Preserve and then the Conservancy is part of that sustainability direction. And that is sustaining that area that could easily have been developed and paved over. And I think that all of us owe it to the people who are going to come after us, our children, our grandchildren, that we act in a very sustainable way. Thank you very much for being so attentive. And now I will gladly answer questions.
Thanks so much, Jacques. As always, such a pleasure to learn from you. But anyone who has a question now, feel free to unmute and ask Jacques
You're not a shy bunch. I know a lot of you. You do speak up.
Well, maybe you were just so informative that there's nothing left to ask, but certainly you gave us a lot to think about. If I were about to build a house, I certainly would look at it in a much different way.
Yeah.
I certainly would be very happy to visit some of those places that I never knew existed
Yeah,
either.
that's right.
Such as, Steve? Which places?
The places that you mentioned,
Arcology, a
Arcology.
word I never
Oh, yeah,
heard
yeah.
before.
Go. It's like, you know, it's an hour from it. Go straight north. It's Arco Santi.
Yeah.
Go.
Sounds wonderful.
I have
Yeah.
a question for Jacques. This is Barbara.
Hi, Barbara.
What is your thinking about like the long-term livability of the Scottsdale area in terms of
Wow.
climate crisis and raising temperatures? I don't mean to be a downer, but
No,
just
no.
what's your thinking?
The issue for me when I left 2 years ago that was beginning to be an issue was water. What I mean, can you inform me about what's happening as far as water and the aquifer, and then the Colorado River and the snowpack up in Colorado, and then it's getting less and less. That's something that really, you know, that in short term worries me more than the long term climate change.
And heat. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's about water. Mhm.
Yeah, because water is used for so many things. I mean, water is life. You don't have water, I mean, you know that just for hiking, how we would repeat to hikers at the trailheads, do you have water with you? You know, make sure you have water. Water is the big issue, and how we use it, how it's recycled, and that to me is in the short term, that's the big thing.
Thank you.
we've heard recently, just north of 136 in an unincorporated, that right down Rio Verde there, that they were on wells and they were getting water shipped in from Scottsdale. Well, it turns out now the people of Scottsdale are saying they're going to need their own water. Now this group of unincorporated areas is searching all over to find a source that would distribute the waters, because not all of them have wells. So I think that's hit home to a lot of us here, realization about what the potential loss of water can mean. You could have $1 million house one day and your house could be worthless the next day.
Yeah, exactly.
And, like you said, water you can't survive without.
Yeah.
Any other questions? If not, it was a pleasure to see you and hear from you again.
Yeah, it's wonderful to touch base with so many of my friends, and let's make sure that we do stay in touch somehow.
For sure.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
And I'll keep you abreast of my own work here with the Nova Scotia Nature Trust.
For sure, it's wonderful to hear that other communities are involving, the people that live there in sustaining the area.
And certainly when I spoke to them about the work that I was doing in Scottsdale, they were impressed. And as I become more involved with them, I wouldn't be surprised that some of what I learned with the Conservancy rubs off on them.
That would be great. That's
Yeah.
awesome.
All right.
Thank you, Jacques. Thank you,
Thank you,
everyone.
Max. Thank you, Steve.
Nice to see you.
Bye, everyone.
Take care. Bye-bye, everyone.